The boardroom sat high above the city, wrapped in glass and steel, a place where decisions were measured in millions and mistakes echoed for years. Morning light poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows, cutting sharp reflections across the long conference table where 12 executives sat in rigid silence. Coffee cups had gone cold. Laptops lay open but untouched. The air felt heavy, strained, like everyone was holding the same breath and afraid to release it. At the head of the table, the man in charge stared at the massive screen mounted on the wall. Lines of code and financial projections glowed in blue and red, numbers stacked so high they felt unreal. $500 million. That was the number no one wanted to say out loud anymore. The merger. The future. Everything rested on fixing a single problem that no one in the room could solve. Voices broke the silence one by one. This is the third time we've hit the same wall. We optimized every pathway. There's no more room to cut. A sharp sigh followed, impatient and irritated. Then explain why the system keeps collapsing under full load. No one answered. Near the far wall, almost blending into the background, a woman pushed a janitorial cart slowly across the polished floor. Her uniform was simple, slightly worn, her shoes scuffed at the toes. She moved carefully, mindful not to interrupt, eyes fixed on the ground as she swapped out a trash liner. A laminated badge hung crookedly from her pocket, though no one bothered to read it. She had been here since before sunrise. Her body ached the way it always did near the end of a long shift. The kind of ache that settled deep into the bones and stayed there. She adjusted her grip on the mop, rolling her shoulders quietly. There was still another building to clean after this one. Another set of floors. Another few hours before she could go home and wake her child for school. At the table, frustration sharpened. We hired the best consultants in the industry. Someone snapped. If they can't fix it, no one can. That's not acceptable. Another replied. Investors are expecting results today. A chair scraped back. If this fails, we're looking at layoffs across 3 departments. The word layoffs hung in the air like a threat. The woman paused, fingers tightening around the handle of the mop. She kept her head down, pretending not to hear, though every word landed heavily. She knew that word too well. She had lived inside it once. She pushed the cart a few feet farther, the wheels squeaking softly despite her effort to keep them quiet. A man near the end of the table glanced in her direction, annoyance flickering across his face. Can we get some quiet in here? He muttered. This is an executive meeting. She nodded quickly, murmuring an apology, even though she hadn't made a sound. Her cheeks warmed as she moved toward the corner, away from the table, wishing she could disappear into the walls. The meeting dragged on. Diagrams were redrawn. The same arguments repeated themselves in slightly different words. Each attempt ended the same way, with someone shaking their head and someone else rubbing their temples. Time slipped by unnoticed, minute after minute bleeding into the next. The woman finished mopping near the whiteboard. As she wrung out the mop, her eyes lifted without thinking. The board was covered in equations, arrows looping back on themselves, notes scrawled hastily in different handwriting. Parts had been erased and rewritten so many times the surface looked cloudy. At the center was a cluster of symbols circled aggressively in red. Her gaze lingered. She had seen patterns like this before. Not here, not in this building, but years ago in another life that felt impossibly far away now. A life where she carried notebooks instead of cleaning supplies. Where she stayed up late not because she had to work a second shift, but because she couldn't stop thinking about how to make something work better, cleaner, faster. She swallowed and looked away. That life was gone. It didn't matter anymore. At the table, a raised voice cut through the room. We're out of time. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. The man in charge stood, hands planted firmly on the table. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it. If this system fails during launch, the merger collapses. $500 million. That's not a hypothetical. That's reality. Someone exhaled sharply. Then what are we supposed to do? No one answered. The woman turned her cart toward the exit. Her shift in this room was nearly done. She should leave before someone told her to again. She took a step, then another. Behind her, someone muttered, "This is impossible." Her foot slowed. She stopped just short of the door. The words echoed in her mind, stirring something restless and uncomfortable. Impossible. She had heard that word too many times before. She had heard it when she tried to go back to work after everything fell apart. When people looked at her resume and then at her life and quietly decided she wasn't worth the risk. She turned slightly, just enough to glance back at the board. The circled section. The looping arrows. The repeating structure. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. She took a breath, steadying herself. It wasn't her place. She knew that. She was here to clean, not to think, not to speak. Speaking only led to embarrassment. To looks that reminded her exactly where she stood. Still, her lips parted. She closed them again. At the table, someone laughed without humor. "We're chasing our own tail." Her grip tightened on the cart. Another voice followed. "We're forcing it to behave the way we want instead of the way it actually does." She felt it then, sharp and sudden. The answer. Simple, elegant, almost obvious once you saw it. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She stood frozen, caught between instinct and experience. "Don't say anything." That voice inside her was loud, practiced, protective. "Don't draw attention. Don't remind them you exist." A memory flashed uninvited. A younger version of herself standing confidently in a room not unlike this one, explaining an idea while others listened. She pushed it away. She wasn't that person anymore. A chair scraped back again. "We're done," someone said bitterly. "There's nothing left to try." The word done settled heavily in her chest. She turned fully now, heart pounding. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the world itself was waiting. Her mouth felt dry as she spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "Excuse me." The sound was small, fragile, but it cut through the silence. Every head turned toward her. Every face in the room turned toward her at once, eyes sharp with surprise and irritation, as if a sudden noise had interrupted something sacred. The silence that followed was not welcoming. It was tight, judgmental, heavy with unspoken questions about why she thought she had the right to speak at all. "Yes?" one of the executives said finally, eyebrows raised. His tone carried forced patience, the kind reserved for interruptions that should never have happened. "Is there a problem?" She felt the weight of every gaze settle on her shoulders. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. The mop handle was slick in her hands, damp with cleaning solution and sweat. For a moment, she considered apologizing and leaving. That was what she always did. Apologize. Move on. Stay invisible. But the image of the whiteboard burned in her mind. "I'm sorry," she said, voice careful, respectful. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I heard what you were saying." A quiet scoff came from the table. "You overheard an executive meeting?" someone muttered. Another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This is a closed session." Her face flushed. "I know. I was just cleaning. I wasn't trying to listen." The man at the head of the table studied her for a second, then sighed. "We're in the middle of something critical. If you need to finish up, please do so quickly." She nodded, throat tight. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave again, forcing her feet to move, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "It's just, you mentioned the system failing when the data repeats." A ripple of annoyance moved through the room. One of the engineers laughed softly. Not cruelly, not loudly. Almost kindly. Which somehow made it worse. "That's not really something you need to worry about." "I wasn't worried," she said quickly. "I was just thinking." "That's exactly the issue," another voice chimed in. "Thinking about this requires years of specialized training." She swallowed. "I understand. I didn't mean." "So what exactly do you think you heard?" the engineer pressed, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. She hesitated. This was the moment she usually backed down. The moment she smiled politely and retreated. Her eyes dropped to the floor, tracing the faint reflections of shoes and chair legs. But then she pictured her son asleep that morning, backpack ready by the door, trusting her to keep everything together somehow. She thought of the bills stacked neatly on her kitchen counter, each one a reminder that failure was not an option. She lifted her head. "I heard you say the algorithm breaks under scale," she said. "When the same data structure repeats." The smirk deepened. And it sounded like you're treating the repetition as an error instead of a feature." The laughter this time was louder. A man near the end of the table shook his head. "This is unbelievable," another added. "We're being lectured by the cleaning staff now?" Her stomach dropped. The words landed harder than she expected, sharp and humiliating. She felt her eyes sting but refused to let tears fall. Crying would only confirm what they already believed about her. "I'm not lecturing anyone," she said quietly. "I was just asking a question." The director who had complained earlier waved a hand dismissively. "Look, this is complex systems engineering. It's not something you can solve by observation." She nodded again. "I know it's complex. Then you should also know," he continued, "that this discussion isn't appropriate for—" He paused, glancing at her uniform. "This situation." The room fell into an awkward silence. She felt very small. The man at the head of the table cleared his throat. "That's enough. Let's refocus." Relief washed through her, mixed with shame. She turned back toward her cart, every step heavy, as if she were wading through water. Her ears burned. She could feel the judgment lingering behind her, see it in her mind even without looking. As she reached the corner, voices resumed, louder now, sharper. "She has no idea what she's talking about. We don't have time for this. Unbelievable." She pretended to focus on rearranging cleaning supplies, though her hands trembled slightly. She told herself she had done the right thing by stopping. That speaking up only ever led to moments like this. At the table, the debate intensified. The recursive loop amplifies latency. But removing it breaks consistency. We can't rewrite the entire architecture this late. A chair slammed forward. Then what's the alternative? No answer came. The woman listened despite herself. The words formed pictures in her mind, patterns clicking together the way they used to. The tension in the room grew thicker with every failed suggestion. Voices overlapped. Frustration turned into open anger. "We're going in circles," someone snapped. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Circles." She glanced back at the whiteboard, unable to stop herself. The looping arrows. The repeated path forcing the system to revisit the same point over and over. It wasn't just inefficient. It was unnecessary. Her heart raced. She told herself again to stay quiet. She had already embarrassed herself once. Pushing further would only make it worse. Then she heard it. "If this fails," a man said quietly, "hundreds of people lose their jobs." The words hit her like a blow. She thought of her own job lost years ago. The panic. The shame. The night staring at the ceiling wondering how quickly everything could unravel. She turned back toward the table, slowly this time, fear and determination warring inside her. "I'm sorry," she said again, louder now, voice steadier. "I know this isn't my place. But I think you're overcomplicating it." Several executives turned sharply in their chairs. "What did you say?" one demanded. She took a step forward despite the knot in her stomach. "You're forcing recursion where you don't need it." An engineer scoffed. "That's the backbone of the model." "Only because you're treating the repeating dataset as variable," she replied. "It isn't. It's constant." The room erupted. "That's not how it works. You can't just remove a loop. This is absurd." Her face burned, but she kept going. "If you collapse it into a closed form, the system stabilizes. There's no overflow. No crash." Silence slammed into the room again, heavier than before. Someone laughed nervously. "Okay, this is getting ridiculous." The man at the head of the table stood slowly. His expression was unreadable. "Do you know what you're suggesting?" She nodded once. Yes. And how exactly would you implement it? Her breath caught. This was it. The line she had already crossed. There was no turning back now. She looked at the whiteboard. May I show you? The room held its breath. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the polite pause of a meeting regaining order. It was the kind that pressed against the ears, thick and electric, as if the room itself were waiting to see who would break first. A few executives exchanged looks. One shook his head slightly, already dismissing the moment as a waste of time. Another checked his watch, jaw tight with irritation. The air carried a mix of disbelief and offense, as though something improper had just occurred. The man at the head of the table studied her carefully. His eyes were sharp, assessing, no longer annoyed but curious in a guarded way. You want to show us, he said slowly, how to fix a system our senior engineers couldn't solve in weeks. She nodded. Her throat was dry, but her mind felt startlingly clear. Yes. A short laugh escaped someone near the end of the table. This is unbelievable. Are we seriously entertaining this? Another muttered. The man didn't look away from her. You have 1 minute. A murmur rippled through the room. 1 minute was more than she had expected. More than she had ever been given before. She stepped forward, heart pounding, each footstep echoing louder than it should have on the polished floor. The whiteboard loomed in front of her, covered in half-erased ideas and red circles that screamed frustration. She picked up the marker with a steady hand, surprised by how familiar it felt, like greeting an old friend. She didn't start explaining. She didn't defend herself. She simply acted. With a quick stroke, she crossed out one of the looping arrows. Gasps followed immediately. Hey! Don't erase that. She kept going. She rewrote a single equation, simplifying it, stripping it down to its core. The marker squeaked softly against the board. She paused just long enough to consider, then added one more line beneath it. That's it, she said. The room didn't explode into laughter this time. It froze. An engineer leaned forward, squinting. That doesn't make sense. Another stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly as he rushed to the board. Wait. Let me see that. Fingers flew over laptop keys. Screens refreshed. Code scrolled. Someone sucked in a sharp breath. No way. The man frowned, typing faster now, shoulders tense. Run it again. A few seconds passed. Then another. It stabilized, someone whispered. The words barely registered at first, like a rumor you don't quite believe. What? A voice snapped. The crash threshold, the engineer said slowly. It's gone. A chair tipped back as someone stood too quickly. That's impossible. She stepped back from the board, marker still in hand, pulse roaring in her ears. Every eye was on the screens now, not on her. She watched their faces shift in real time, confusion melting into shock, disbelief turning into something dangerously close to awe. The man at the head of the table approached the board slowly, staring at the rewritten equation as if it might vanish if he blinked. Explain this, he said quietly. She hesitated for half a second, then spoke. You treated the repeating dataset like it had to be recalculated every cycle, she said. But it doesn't change. You were creating the failure you were trying to prevent. One of the engineers swallowed hard. We assumed the repetition increased risk. It only does if you let it, she replied. If you isolate it as a constant, the system stops fighting itself. Silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of electronics. A man who had laughed earlier sank slowly back into his chair. We never even considered that. Another shook his head, stunned. We dismissed it as too simple. She felt something loosen in her chest at those words. Too simple. She had heard that before, spoken like an insult. The man turned to her fully now. Where did you learn this? Her fingers tightened around the marker. For a moment, the room blurred slightly as memories surged forward, uninvited and sharp. Late nights. Whiteboards covered in equations. Conversations that stretched until dawn. A life that had once revolved around solving problems just like this. I used to do this, she said softly. A few people frowned. Do what? Design systems. Optimize models. Fix failures. One of the engineers stared at her uniform, then back at the board. Then why are you here? The question wasn't cruel. It was confused. And somehow that hurt more. She took a breath. Because life doesn't care how smart you are. The room went still again. My husband died, she continued, voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Suddenly. One day everything was fine, and the next day nothing was. I took time off. Too much time, according to the industry. No one interrupted her. I had a child. Responsibilities. Bills that didn't wait for interviews. I applied everywhere. I stopped counting the rejections. She set the marker down gently. Cleaning pays on time. A few heads lowered. One man rubbed the back of his neck, guilt creeping into his expression. The man at the head of the table looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. What's your name? She hesitated, then said it. He nodded once, committing it to memory. Then he turned to the room. Do you all understand what just happened? No one spoke. This problem threatened $500 million, he said evenly. And the solution was standing in this room the entire time. His gaze swept across the executives, the engineers, the people who had scoffed and laughed. Ignored? A wave of discomfort rolled through the room. He turned back to her. How long would it take to implement this properly? She thought for a moment. A day. 2 to be safe. The engineers exchanged stunned looks. You're sure? One asked. She nodded. Very. The man straightened. Then that's what we'll do. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and spoke without looking away from her. Cancel my afternoon. All of it. Murmurs erupted again. And get HR here, he added. Immediately. Her breath caught. Sir, He held up a hand. You just solved the problem no one else in this room could. He turned back to the table, voice firm. Effective immediately, she's part of this team. A stunned silence followed. Executive level, he continued. Full authority on implementation. Someone started to protest. You can't just. I can't, he cut in. And I am. She stood there, frozen, heart racing, unsure whether to speak or breathe or move. The room felt unreal, like a dream that might collapse if she blinked. The man looked back at her, his tone softer now. You don't have to clean floors anymore. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, steadying herself. He added quietly but clearly, unless you want to. A few nervous laughs escaped the room, but no one missed the weight behind his words. She shook her head slowly. No, she said. I think I'm done with that. As the engineers gathered around the board again, this time listening closely as she spoke, one thought echoed through her mind, steady and powerful. They were finally listening. And nothing would ever be the same again. The room slowly came back to life, but it no longer felt like the same place. Chairs were pulled closer to the table instead of pushed back. Laptops turned toward her instead of away. The energy shifted from dismissal to urgency, from ego to attention. People who had laughed only minutes ago now waited for her to speak, pens hovering, screens ready. She felt the weight of it all settle in her chest, heavy and unreal. Her hands still trembled slightly, though her voice stayed steady as she walked through the changes step by step. Questions came fast now, not mocking, not impatient, but careful. What happens under peak load? How does this affect redundancy? Will it scale beyond projections? She answered each one calmly, precisely, the way she used to. With clarity. With confidence. With the quiet authority of someone who had already lived through the problem in her mind and come out the other side. Hours passed without anyone noticing. At some point, someone brought in fresh coffee. Another ordered food, insisting she eat first. The gesture caught her off guard more than anything else that had happened that day. She thanked them softly, still half expecting someone to tell her this was all a mistake, that she needed to go back to her cart and finish mopping the hallway. But no one did. By the time the final test finished running, the sun had shifted across the sky, painting the city outside in warm gold. Numbers stabilized on the screen. Alerts stayed silent. The system held. A breath released collectively, like a pressure valve finally opening. "It's done," someone said, almost afraid to say it too loudly. The man who led the room leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as if it had personally wronged him for weeks. Then he laughed, low and disbelieving. $500 million, he said quietly. Just like that. Applause broke out. Not polite clapping. Real applause. The kind that fills the space and leaves nowhere to hide. She froze again, overwhelmed, heat rushing to her face. She wasn't used to being seen like this. Being celebrated. She lowered her eyes, suddenly shy. "I just fixed what was broken." He shook his head. "No. You did more than that." He stood and addressed the room. "I want this to be very clear. What happened today is on us." The applause faded into attentive silence. "We failed," he continued. "Not because we lacked intelligence or resources. We failed because we decided, without ever saying it out loud, who was worth listening to." No one argued. He gestured toward her. She spoke up twice. Twice. And both times we tried to shut her down. A few people shifted uncomfortably. "If she hadn't insisted," he said, "this company would be explaining to investors why $500 million disappeared." He turned back to her. "You shouldn't have had to fight to be heard." Her throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to speak. Later, when the room finally emptied and the adrenaline wore off, she stood alone by the window. The city looked different from up here now. Not smaller. Not larger. Just reachable. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, still wearing the same uniform she'd walked in with that morning. She hadn't changed clothes. She hadn't changed who she was. But everything else had shifted. A knock sounded softly behind her. He stepped into the room again, no longer the intimidating figure at the head of the table, just a man who looked tired and thoughtful. "I wanted to say this without an audience," he said. She turned. "Okay. I'm sorry," he said simply. The word landed gently, without excuses, without conditions. "I should have stopped it sooner," he continued. "The comments. The dismissal. The assumptions." She studied his face, searching for anything false. She found none. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "HR is drafting an offer. Compensation, benefits, equity. I won't insult you by pretending it makes up for anything. But it reflects your value to this company." She took a slow breath. "I don't want special treatment." He smiled faintly. "Good. Neither do I. I want fairness." She considered that, then nodded. As she gathered her things, she noticed her cart still parked quietly in the corner, exactly where she had left it. For a moment, she just looked at it. The mop. The gloves. The life she had lived for so long without complaint. She walked over and straightened the supplies, habit guiding her hands. Then she paused, removed the photo from her pocket, and tucked it carefully into her bag instead. She didn't need to hide it anymore. When she stepped out into the hallway, she nearly collided with another janitor pushing a cart in the opposite direction. The woman stopped, startled. "Oh, sorry," the woman said quickly. She smiled. "No problem." The woman hesitated, glancing at the boardroom behind her. They said you did something amazing." She shrugged lightly. "I did what I could." The woman looked at her uniform, then at her face, eyes wide with something like hope. "Guess that means it's possible, huh?" She met her gaze. "It always was." Later that evening, she picked up her son from after-school care. He ran to her, backpack bouncing, smiling the way he always did when he saw her. "You're late," he said. "I know," she replied, kneeling to his level. "But I have a really good reason." "Did you work extra?" She smiled, brushing his hair back. Something like that. At home, she cooked dinner without rushing for the first time in years. They laughed. They talked. She tucked him into bed, and when he asked if she'd be tired tomorrow, she hesitated. No, she said softly. I don't think so. After he fell asleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the contract on her phone. The words felt heavy, real, undeniable. She thought back to the moment she almost stayed silent. To the laughter. To the looks that tried to put her back where they believed she belonged. She sighed. The next morning, she walked into the building again, but this time through the front doors. Heads turned. Some smiled. Some looked stunned. No one laughed. She passed the boardroom, catching a glimpse of the whiteboard through the glass. Her equations were still there, untouched. For years she had been invisible by design. Conveniently overlooked. Easily dismissed. But the truth was simple, and it always had been. Brilliance doesn't disappear just because life gets hard. And sometimes, the person who saves everything is the one everyone forgot to see.